Wyoming Territory, September 1882. The first thing he saw was the girl kneeling in the dust beside a still body. Her small hands clutched around her mother's cooling fingers, the sun already pulling the color from her cheeks. Noah Callahan reined in his horse. The girl looked no older than 10. She did not cry, did not scream. Just sat there, her dress torn near the hem, a streak of blood on her cheek, her eyes stuck on the woman lying flat beside the wagon wheel. The horse team was gone. The canvas was slashed. There had been a struggle here and no survivors but her. Noah dismounted and stepped carefully, the dry grass crunching under his boots. His rifle stayed slung, but his hand hovered near it. He had seen scenes like this before, Indians blamed, but more often it was outlaws, desperate men. He crouched low beside the girl. "Name?" he asked, voice low. She blinked slowly, then finally looked at him. Her lips parted, but she could not speak. He didn't press. Instead, he stood and gently lifted the woman's wrist. "Cold, gone hours ago." "I'll bury her," he said. The girl nodded once, then looked away. It took Noah an hour to dig the grave. The dirt was dry and stubborn. He found a piece of wood from the wagon and carved the woman's name into it with his knife once the girl whispered it. Mary Ellison. He placed the marker in the earth, then stepped back. The girl moved closer and placed a small ribbon beside the mound. Still, she did not cry. Noah turned to his horse, then looked back. "You coming?" She hesitated. "I ain't leaving you out here." That was all he said. She followed. Her name was Juliet. She was 9, and her father had died last spring back in Kansas. Her mother had tried to make it west on her own. They had joined a small wagon train, but somewhere along the trail, the others had taken a different fork. Then the attack came. Noah listened as she spoke quietly beside the fire that night, her voice dry and raw. He gave her water. A bedroll. The corner of his coat when the wind picked up. A man of few words, Noah watched her carefully. She clung to silence, but he saw the way she jumped at every coyote howl, the way she stared into the flames like she expected her mother to climb out of them. He did not ask questions. He did not offer false comfort. He just stayed. For 2 weeks they rode west. Noah had not planned to take in a child. He had been bound for Fort Bridger to trade horses and keep on through the mountains. Solitude was what he knew. But the girl needed food, protection, and someone who would not leave her behind. So he adjusted. He kept her close, taught her how to tell the wind's direction, how to find clean water, how to keep quiet near rattlers. She learned fast. She did not cry anymore. But sometimes, in the early morning, he caught her holding her mother's ribbon like it could call her back. By the 3rd week, they reached a small town called Elk Hollow, tucked between cottonwoods and a slow-moving creek. Noah planned to leave her with the preacher's wife. He stood outside the whitewashed chapel with Juliet at his side, hand on her shoulder. But when the preacher's wife stepped out and smiled, Juliet stepped behind Noah, her small hand twisted into the back of his coat. He looked down at her, then back at the woman. "She's staying with me," he said simply. 3 years passed. Juliet grew taller, stronger. Her hair darkened to chestnut, her laughter returned in pieces. She helped Noah with the horses, learned to patch clothes, and took to reading in the evenings. Noah built a small cabin outside town and they lived quiet, steady lives. He kept to himself. Folks in town called him the silent cowboy, a man who spoke only when needed but whose eyes said enough. Juliet kept close to him. She never called him father and he never tried to be one. But they were a unit. Unspoken, unshaken. Then came the spring of 1885, and with it a woman. Her name was Violet Emerson. She arrived in Elk Hollow with a trunk full of books, a soft voice, and a stubborn streak that did not match her gentle looks. 23, unmarried, and sent west to teach at the schoolhouse after her father died back in St. Louis. Noah first saw her when he rode into town for supplies. She was standing on the schoolhouse steps, arms crossed, arguing with the blacksmith about a broken stove. "I'm not asking for charity," she said. "I am asking for your word." The blacksmith grunted and walked off. Noah watched her for a long moment. She turned, spotted him, and lifted her chin. "You," she marched straight to him. You know anyone who can fix a stove without charging $2 just to look at it? He stared at her. She blinked. Do you speak? Sometimes, he said. Her mouth twitched. Well, I hope this is one of those times. He fixed the stove. She made him coffee. From then on, Violet Emerson always looked Noah's way when he rode into town. And Juliet noticed. You like her, she said one night, poking the fire. Noah looked up slowly. Juliet shrugged. She makes you talk more. He did not deny it. Violet was not like the women Noah had known. She asked questions. She smiled too easily. She had a laugh that made his chest ache. She was soft-spoken but fierce when she wanted something done right. She walked into his quiet life like a wind that did not knock things over, just opened windows he had forgotten were there. He found himself riding into town more often, and she started riding out to the cabin. She brought books for Juliet and pie for Noah, though she claimed the pie was to thank him for tolerating her chatter. One afternoon, after a long silence under the porch roof, Violet looked sideways at him. You ever think about marrying? She asked. Noah's jaw worked. No, she nodded. You think you never will? He looked at her then, really looked. I think I might, he said. She smiled, slow and steady. Good. By summer, Violet came to stay, not just for the night. Not just for the season. She brought her trunk, her books, her heart. Noah made room, and Juliet, now 12, grinned when Violet pulled her into a hug and said, Looks like we are both where we belong now. The cabin felt fuller, warmer. Noah still did not speak much. But when Violet slipped her hand into his beneath the stars, he whispered, I love you. She held tighter. I know, I love you too. And for the first time in years, he smiled. The wind carried the scent of wild sage that morning, and a light frost clung to the porch rail. Violet stood over the basin near the cabin door, sleeves rolled to the elbow as she wrung out a cloth. Her fingers had gone red from the cold, but she didn't seem to notice. Inside, Noah trimmed a cedar board with his drawknife. Each pull of the blade was slow and sure, the sound steady as a heartbeat. Juliet sat cross-legged on the floor nearby, turning pages in a worn geography reader Violet had brought from the schoolhouse before term ended. You ever seen the Mississippi? She asked, not looking up. Noah watched the curl of wood fall from the board. Once. Juliet traced a river line with her thumb. Does it feel as big as it looks? He considered. Bigger. Violet stepped in, drying her hands on her apron. It's a floodplain where I'm from. Entire summers spent with the air thick as honey and the river swollen to its banks. Juliet turned the book toward her. You live near the delta, far north of it. But the river's wide all the same, Violet said, then crouched beside her. The first time I saw it, I was 5. Thought it was the whole world. Noah set down the drawknife, wiping his palms on his trousers. We'll take her someday, he said, voice low. Let her decide for herself. Violet's eyes lifted. You'd go east, not forever. Something in her face softened, but she didn't answer. Instead, she stood and began folding the dried linens from a basket near the stove. That evening, Juliet stayed behind with the neighbor's wife, helping churn butter in exchange for a new slate. Noah and Violet walked the narrow path toward the creek, their shadows long across the grass. The sun had dipped low, catching the tops of the cottonwoods in orange flame. I never thought I'd live outside a town, Violet said, stepping over a root. Trouble with it? Noah asked, brushing a branch aside for her. No, She paused. I used to think quiet meant something was missing, he glanced toward her. But now I think it just means nothing's wasted, she added. They reached the bend in the creek where the water pooled deeper. A pair of ducks floated near the far bank, their feathers glossy with light. Violet sat on a flat stone, tugging her shawl closer. Juliet's reading faster than I expected, she said. She listens close. She watches close, Violet said. Especially when you're near. Noah crouched beside the water, dragging a stick through the mud. She's made of stone and ash. But there's fire in her still. Violet tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. You never talk about the trail, about how you found her. Noah didn't lift his head. What good would it do? I don't know, maybe none. He let the stick drop. She didn't cry, that's what I remember most. Just sat there like her whole body forgot how to move. Violet's voice gentled. And you stayed. I couldn't leave her, not after looking in her eyes. For a while, the only sound was water threading through reeds. You've never said it aloud before, Violet murmured. Noah finally turned to her. Some things don't need saying, you know them in your bones. She reached out, her fingers brushing his wrist. Still, I'm glad you did. He covered her hand with his. The creek whispered past them. Later, they walked back through the growing dusk, their fingers laced. When they reached the cabin, Juliet was asleep on the cot beneath the front window, arms wrapped around her new slate. A thin line of chalk dust streaked her cheek. Noah lifted her gently and carried her to the back room without waking her. Violet pulled the quilt up and kissed the girl's temple. In the kitchen, Violet lit the oil lamp. Her face glowed beneath the glass chimney, soft and steady. I'm thinking of planting squash this year, she said as she stripped off her shawl. There's a hollow near the barn that gets good sun. Noah poured a small measure of coffee into 2 cups. You'll want fencing. Deer come down early. She accepted the cup. I'll trade lessons for help. Some of the older boys are strong enough. They sat across from each other, the lamplight pooling between them. You ever think you'd end up here? She asked. He shook his head. Didn't think much past the next trail. Do you miss it? No, not since you came. Violet's gaze held his. I keep waiting for the part where you ride off. I won't, she nodded. I know. He reached across the table. His fingers touched hers, calloused and warm. The room was still. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the smell of damp earth. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird called once and fell silent. Inside, no one spoke. There was no need. Morning would come. The girl would rise and read. The woman would knead bread and plan her planting. And the cowboy who once rode alone and spoke only when pressed would stay. The first snow came early that year, soft flakes drifting through the air like feathers shaken loose from some high place. Violet stepped outside just after dawn, her shawl drawn tight and boots crunching over the crusted grass. She stood with her face tilted up, watching the sky. Her breath made small clouds. The cabin behind her was still warm from the banked fire, the scent of rye porridge lingering in the air. Noah was already at the paddock, checking the latch on the gate. One of the colts had a habit of nosing it open. He straightened when he saw her approach, a quiet stillness settling between them, the kind that didn't ask to be broken. Ground's hardening, she said. He nodded toward the hills. We'll need to cut more wood before it sets in. I'll help. You'll freeze. I've been colder, she said, brushing a snowflake from her brow. Besides, I could use the work. He didn't argue. They walked together to the far edge of the property, where the timber line thickened into pine and spruce. The hatchet handles were slick with cold, but Violet's grip held. She worked steady, not for show, and Noah didn't slow his pace for her. By midday, they'd stacked a fair pile on the sled, the snow now ankle-deep. He glanced at her hands as they headed back. You'll blister. I'm not made of lace. Didn't say you were. She smiled without turning, cheeks red with wind. I like that you don't try to stop me. You don't need stopping. That evening, Violet stood at the stove, stirring a pot of rabbit stew while Juliet practiced ciphering at the table. The girl scratched numbers with the side of her lip tucked in, her brow furrowed. 8 times 9 is 72, she said aloud, then looked at Violet. Right. Check your work, Violet replied, not looking away from the bubbling pot. Don't guess. No. Juliet muttered and rubbed out the answer with the heel of her hand. Noah stepped in from the barn, snow melting from his coat. He paused by the door, eyes sweeping the room. Violet caught his gaze, offered a small nod. He hung his coat, then crossed to the hearth, crouching to check the flames. Juliet set her slate aside. Martha says her cousin in Rock Springs has seen a train. Violet ladled stew into the bowls. I've seen one. Loud as thunder, fast as anything, but it doesn't smell near as nice. Will we ever see one? Noah straightened. Maybe come spring. Juliet looked at him. Would you ride it? He met her eyes. If I had a reason. The girl nodded thoughtfully, then picked up a spoon. After supper, Juliet drifted to sleep on the bearskin rug, curled around the dog Violet had taken in from the edge of town. He was half blind and mostly bones when she found him, but he followed her ever since. Violet poured hot water into a basin and wrung out a cloth. "Your shoulder again?" she asked, turning toward Noah where he sat by the stove. He didn't answer but unbuttoned his shirt and slid it down one arm. A dark bruise had bloomed near the joint. "Did you fall?" He winced as she pressed the cloth to him. "Colt kicked the gate. Stubborn animal, so's the man that raised him." She dipped the cloth again. "You ever think of selling the horses?" He looked at her, puzzled. "You've got enough saved. We could do something else." "Like what?" "Open a store or a smithy or nothing, just live." He was quiet. The fire popped. "I don't mind the work," she said. "But sometimes I wonder if you keep riding out because you think you have to. I don't know how to sit still." "You do," she said gently. "You just don't know it yet." He watched her fingers move, slow and certain. "You'd stay if I did." "I already did." That night, the wind came hard through the trees, rattling the shutters. Noah rose twice to check the latches, then stood in the dark, listening to the weight of the storm. Violet stirred in her sleep, her arm brushing his chest. He laid his hand over hers and stayed like that until dawn pushed weak light through the curtains. In the days that followed, drifts piled high along the fence lines. Travel into town slowed to nothing. Violet read aloud in the evenings, her voice steady while Juliet stitched patches onto the knees of her trousers. Noah worked leather by the window, crafting new reins and mending old boots. One morning, Juliet came in from feeding the chickens, her cheeks flushed and eyes bright. "There's smoke past the ridge," she said, tugging off her mittens. "Not ours." Noah stood. "Which way?" "Northwest. By the old trail fork." He was out the door before she finished, rifle slung across his back. He returned hours later, boots caked in mud and snow. Violet met him halfway to the barn. "Travelers?" she asked. He nodded. "One wagon, stuck fast, family of 6. Are they safe?" "For now. I brought their boy back with me." "Wagon's too heavy to move without help." Violet stepped aside as a boy of about 14 came forward, his face wind-chapped, eyes wary. Juliet offered him a mug of broth without a word. He took it, grateful, and sat by the fire. "They'll need shelter," Violet said. "They can't stay in the wagon." "Storm's turning again. We'll make room." Noah hesitated, then gave a small nod. That night they cleared the loft. Violet laid out bedrolls and Juliet brought extra blankets. The boy Caleb sat near the hearth, watching Violet's hands as she kneaded dough. "You bake like my ma," he said. "She around?" He looked down. "She's out there, in the wagon." Violet placed the dough in the pan. "She'll be warm soon." He nodded, eyes glinting. Later, as the wind picked up again, Noah stood at the window, arms crossed. "You did good," Violet said behind him. "They're strangers. They're people." He turned. "It's a risk." "So was I," she said softly. He looked at her for a long moment, then he stepped forward, wrapped his arms around her waist and buried his face in her shoulder. And for the first time since the day he found a girl in the dust with nothing left but silence, he let himself be held. By late January, the cold carried a sharper bite. Ice hung from the pump spout, and the snowdrifts around the barn reached Violet's waist. Inside the cabin, the air stayed warm enough, the woodpile dwindling slower than expected thanks to careful rationing and Noah's foresight. The family from the wagon Caleb's folks had settled into the loft space quietly, grateful without being burdensome. The mother, Ada, stitched by lantern light and offered to mend anything with a tear. Her husband, Daniel, kept to chores without needing to be asked. The other children, 2 girls with matching braids and a baby still crawling, took to Violet quickly. Juliet didn't mind the company. She had someone close to her age now, and she shared her schoolbooks without being told. Violet noticed she'd started speaking more, even laughing in short bursts. The shape of grief was still there, but softened at the edges. One afternoon, while the wind hurled itself against the walls, Noah and Daniel took the sled out to gather feed Ada had stored in a cache 2 miles east. Violet stayed behind to watch the children and stir the beans that simmered in the pot. The baby fussed in her arms, and Juliet tried her best to juggle the older girl's questions about how snow could be both water and not. "Why doesn't it melt on your hand right away?" one of them asked, squinting out the window. "It depends how warm you are," Juliet said, brushing a curl from her forehead. "Your fingers are cold, it'll stay longer." The girl blinked. "How do you know that?" "I pay attention." Violet smiled from the stove but didn't interrupt. That night, after supper and stories, Juliet lingered by the coals while Violet wiped down the table. The soft glow from the lantern caught the girl's face, and something in her expression had changed. "He doesn't talk as much when others are around," Juliet said quietly. Violet paused. "No, he doesn't. Doesn't mean he's not watching." "No," Violet agreed, setting the rag down. "He sees more than most who never stop talking." Juliet picked at a loose thread on her sleeve. "You think he's happy?" Violet leaned on her hands, studying her. "He's content." "Which means more." "Is that because of you?" Violet shook her head. "It's because of you first." Juliet looked away, but her shoulders lifted just slightly. When the storm eased the next morning, the sky turned pale blue and the snow steamed where the sun hit it. Noah came in from the barn, his fingers pink and stiff. Violet handed him a cup of warmed cider without a word, and he held her gaze a moment before he drank. "Daniel said the feed was dry," she offered. "Cash held tight," he said. "We'll be fine through February." She reached for his gloves and worked the stiffness from the leather. "You planning to ride out come thaw?" "Depends what's needed." "Not what's needed, what you want." He didn't answer right away. "Then I don't mind staying put." Violet folded the gloves and laid them on the sill. "I want to marry you in spring." Noah stood still, watching her like the air had gone still too. "You don't have to say anything," she added. I wanted to say it first." He stepped forward, took her hand in both of his, and kissed her knuckles. "You didn't have to ask," he said, "but I'm glad you did." Later, while the others rested, he pulled a small tin from the drawer where he kept rifle patches and old coins. Inside was a ring plain brass, smoothed at the edges, something he'd carried since summer and never found the words for. Violet didn't speak when he offered it, only reached for him and held the back of his neck, her forehead pressed to his. Juliet caught sight of them through the doorframe, then turned away with a small, private smile. By March, the snow began to sink. The drifts bled into the soil, leaving patches of brown grass and flattened brush. Daniel and his family packed their things slowly, refusing offers to stay longer. There was a homestead waiting for them east of Green River, and Ada had family there who could help. On the morning they left, Violet handed Ada a parcel of dried fruit and a jar of corn cakes. Ada hugged her tightly. "You took us in without question," she said. "I won't forget it." "Just pass it on," Violet said. Daniel shook Noah's hand, then clapped his shoulder. "You've built something steady here." Noah nodded once. Caleb lingered before climbing into the wagon. Juliet avoided his eye, but when he held out a folded page from her geography book, she took it. "I marked the river you asked about," he said. She tucked it into her coat pocket. "Thanks." They didn't say goodbye. Some things didn't need saying. That evening, Noah sat on the porch rail, whittling a length of pine into something that might become a spoon. Violet stood inside the doorway, brushing her hair. She was wearing the blue dress she'd brought west, the one with the stitching coming loose at the sleeve. "You want a wedding in town?" he asked. "No, right here under the cottonwoods. I'll ask the preacher to ride out." "I already did," she said. He looked at her, then back at the wood in his hands. "You always know what you want, not always." "But I know what I have." He set the knife down and reached for her wrist, drawing her close. "You've got me," he said. "I've had you since the first time you fixed that stove." He kissed her then, slow and certain, like every word he hadn't said lived in that one moment. Juliet watched from the window, the page from Caleb still in her hand. She didn't cry, she didn't speak, but her heart was full. And for the first time since the trail took her mother, she knew she belonged. The thaw came slower than expected. By the time the cottonwoods began to show their first pale green, the creek ran high with meltwater, and mud clung to the wagon wheels like it meant to stay till summer. Violet stood at the edge of the clearing, her boots sunk half an inch deep, a bucket of creek water in one hand and her shawl gathered tight in the other. She watched a pair of red-winged blackbirds dart through the trees, their calls sharp and sure, and smiled to herself. Inside, Noah was sealing the last plank into a low bench he'd built for the ceremony. His knuckles were scraped, and a thin line of sawdust clung to the collar of his shirt, but his hands moved with the kind of quiet purpose that belonged to men who had once wandered and no longer needed to. "Juliet's hanging the ribbons now," Violet said as she stepped into the doorway. He glanced up. She picked the color, she wouldn't hear of anything but green, said it matches the grass when it's just starting to wake up. He nodded, brushing the sawdust from his knees. "She's right." Violet leaned against the doorframe, watching him. "I never thought I'd be married under trees instead of in a chapel. You regret it?" "Not once." The preacher arrived on a borrowed buckboard, his coat patched at the elbow and a small leather-bound book in his lap. Noah met him at the trail's edge, offered him a hand and a place to sit, and neither of them spoke much after that. Violet laid out bread and apple butter, strong coffee in tin mugs. The preacher nodded his thanks and kept to his own thoughts. Juliet appeared just before dusk with a ribbon trailing from her braid and a wildflower tucked behind her ear. She carried a folded cloth bundle and handed it to Violet without a word. Inside, Violet unwrapped it. A new apron, stitched by hand, the seams neat but uneven. "I wanted to make something useful," Juliet said. "Not just pretty," Violet smoothed the fabric. "It's perfect." The sun dropped low and the trees caught the last light like they'd been waiting for it. The guests were few. The neighbor from up the ridge brought her youngest, and Daniel's family returned for the day, their wagon now pulled by a single sturdy mule and their clothes mended with care. Ada held the baby on her hip and pressed Violet's hands as they passed beneath the branches. Noah stood beneath the tallest cottonwood, his hair damp from a quick wash and his shirt collar pressed flat. He didn't shift or fidget. He only watched Violet as she crossed the grass, her dress simple and the sleeves rolled just enough to show her wrists. Her eyes never left his. The preacher opened his book, thumbed to a page and cleared his throat. "You come together of your own hearts," Violet answered. "Yes." Noah said, "I do." The vows were short. No promises of fine homes or fortunes, just the steady offering of hands of truth of staying. When the preacher closed the book, Noah reached for Violet's hand and kissed her palm. The guests clapped softly, but Violet barely heard them. She was looking at him, and he was looking at her like the world had narrowed to the space between them. Afterward, they ate bread and cheese, passed around a jar of pickled beans, and drank cider until the stars came out. Juliet sat between Violet and Noah, her chin tucked into her knees, watching the fire. Caleb nudged her shoulder once, but she didn't move. When the others left, Violet walked with Noah back to the cabin, her hand tucked inside his coat. The air had turned cold again, but not sharp. Inside, the fire had burned low, and Juliet had gone to sleep with her braids still loose and a book open on her chest. Violet covered her with the quilt and kissed her forehead. Noah poured warm water into the basin and handed Violet a cloth. "You first," he said. She dipped it, wiped the soot from her hands, and looked at him over her shoulder. "I love you," he met her gaze. "I've loved you since you asked me about that stove," she laughed quietly. "I knew." They laid down on the bed they'd built together, the mattress stuffed with wool Violet had cleaned and sewn herself, the frame carved from pine Noah had hauled from the ridge. His hand found hers beneath the quilt, and she turned toward him, her nose brushing his cheek. "Tomorrow," she said, "I'll plant the squash in the south corner. I'll mend the fence," she smiled. "That's marriage, isn't it? Sounds like love to me." In the months that followed, the garden took root. The squash leaves sprawled like green suns, and the beans climbed the poles faster than Violet expected. Juliet learned to ride without gripping the saddle horn, her back straight and her mouth set in quiet determination. Noah watched her from the porch, arms crossed, and said nothing, but Violet saw the pride in his eyes. When the schoolhouse reopened in the fall, Violet rode in twice a week, her lessons packed in a satchel and her hair tied back in a new ribbon Juliet had chosen. She taught numbers and words, but also silence and attention and the way to hold still long enough to see birds nesting in the far trees. Noah built a second paddock, took on 2 more horses, and began teaching Juliet how to read their moods by the tilt of their ears. She listened carefully, never smiling while he spoke, but he caught her humming as she brushed the mares in the early light. On the first snow of the next winter, Violet stood at the window, her hands resting lightly on her stomach. Noah wrapped his arms around her from behind. "You sure?" he asked. She nodded. "I'm sure." He pressed his lips to her temple and stayed there, the snow falling soft beyond the glass. By the next spring, the baby came a boy with Noah's quiet eyes and Violet's stubborn chin. Juliet held him first, her arms steady, her face unreadable. Then she looked up at Violet and whispered, "He's home." And he was, and so were they, forever.